Hello, welcome to another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. Ryan, how are we doing today?
I'm all right. How are you?
Doing great.
Good.
We have a guest that is calling in on Teams, Dr. Emily Meccage from Forage Genetics International. She is the Product and Development Manager for Forage Genetics International with Land O'Lakes. So, Dr. Meccage, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, well, we'll get into introductions a little more deeply, but first we have this thing on the high ground called the question of the day. And you, being a guest, get to go first. And so here is your question of the day. Dr. Meccage, how would you describe your job to a 5-year-old?
Well, considering my own family can't describe what I do, this can get really interesting. Probably the easiest way to explain it to my kids is I help make alfalfa more nutritious and better for animals to eat. So that's probably the easiest way to boil it down.
Now, let me be a 5-year-old. Why? Why? Why?
Why not?
Why?
Why not? That's what I tell my kids.
Well, that was well done. She made it sound pretty easy. Well, Ryan,
I have no idea.
how would you describe your job to a 5-year-old?
Um,
I should turn my computer camera around and show the look on Ryan's face right now.
This is really difficult. So,
How would you describe your job to an adult?
right? Yeah, that's exactly right. That makes it tough. So,
Ryan's the chief operating officer at Premier Ag, so I'm going to see how he does that to a 5-year-old.
we're going to have to edit like 15 minutes of my fumbling around here. So, I think I would.
I bet Harold's going to be listening to this.
Yeah, I'm sure he is. I can't explain what I do to him, and I'm trying to justify it to him. So, but no. So I think I would tell a 5-year-old that
Go outside and play.
yeah, right. Leave me alone. Go find something to do. So no, that I manage people, and we try our best to. Man, oh man, what a terrible question.
That's tough.
It is tough. So
Man, didn't even have a heads up on this one?
No, not at all.
Oh, we didn't. No, I found out at the same time you did. So, yeah. So anyway, no, I manage people and try to help the organization run smoothly. And a 5-year-old should be satisfied with that question.
If you're not going outside.
Right, exactly right. Or ground them.
Okay, well, let's moving on. So,
You're doing it now. So and I'm curious to know what you do anyway. So
exactly,
I'm going to listen
right?
intently myself.
how would I describe it to a 5-year-old? Well, since my wife and daughter don't really know what I do either, I don't think. But I think what I would describe it to a 5-year-old would be like, I would say that I help farmers with good things for the land. How's that?
Okay. All right.
I kill weeds and bugs.
There you go.
And help things grow.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Kill
I
weeds,
do too.
Weeds, bugs, and help things grow.
I do too. Perfect. Yeah. Then do they ask you then why you don't leave the house till 10 a.m.? No.
Because you got to catch that 9 o'clock Sports Center.
Right,
What do you?
Exactly. All right. Get back to the guest. It's something important.
Dr. Meccage, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And can you tell us, just a brief introduction, tell us about how you got here today, meaning kind of your path toward Forage Genetics International and what your role is as an adult would understand it. And so, yeah. And just introductions, please.
Sure, yeah. So I had a very nonlinear path to where I am today. All of my degrees are actually in animal nutrition. When I finished my PhD at Minnesota, I actually moved out to Montana State University, and I was the extension forage specialist and professor out there for about 5 years. So got to do a lot of really cool research on a lot of different species, annuals, perennials, legumes, grasses, pretty much anything that you can feed an animal. After doing that for about 5 years, then I decided to move back home to Pennsylvania, and I actually found this role at Forage Genetics, where I was hired as the lead agronomist for the company. And then about a year ago, I was brought on as the product and development manager. So I manage all of our products for our internal brands.
All right. So tell for our listeners who may not be familiar with Forage Genetics International as a cooperative, we're familiar with that, but just tell our listeners and those that aren't knowledgeable about what we're talking about when we talk about Forage Genetics and with Land O'Lakes.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Forage Genetics, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of Land O'Lakes, and we are the world's largest seed genetics supplier and marketer. So we have our own internal brands as well as broadly licensing our products to other brands as well. And we also we helped create and we own the Roundup Ready alfalfa and HarvXtra alfalfa technologies. So we're the only company, the only trait provider in the industry for alfalfa.
So we're all familiar with Roundup Ready. What's HarvXtra?
Great question. So HarvXtra is actually a genetically modified alfalfa plant. It's a trait where the plant produces lower amounts of lignin. And so that means that as that plant matures, the digestibility is higher than, say, a conventional alfalfa at the same maturity because of that lower lignin. It has higher digestibility. So we see a couple benefits from that. Namely, if you maintain the same harvest schedule as you normally would, you typically get a higher again, digestible product, higher quality, or what we're seeing more people use it for is you can actually delay harvest by a couple days, and you actually can have higher yields, but have similar quality to a conventional alfalfa that was harvested a couple days before.
All right.
So let's not get too far from alfalfa. And I don't want to dwell necessarily on specific products, but alfalfa is interesting when you talk about harvest date because for some of our listeners, we like to think that we have listeners out there that have no familiarity with what we do. So we think about harvest around here in fall and soybeans and corn. So we do that one time a year. We would have maybe wheat. They might understand the wheat in the summer. So we talk about harvesting alfalfa as you were just discussing. That's a multi-time of a year process. So just quickly, I mean, as far as buying an alfalfa, not all alfalfa is the same. Not all harvest rotations or frequencies are the same. Talk just a little bit about that, just to open that up a little.
Yeah, so I mean, we could talk about this for a lot
if
we wanted to. So
I figured.
it'll vary a lot from one part of the country to the next. So in your guys' part of the world, a lot of times alfalfa can be harvested anywhere between 3 to 5 times a year. We talk about harvest intervals a lot. Again, it depends on what you're growing it for, whether it be dairy or horses or beef cattle. That can impact how often you harvest as well. A lot of people are typically harvesting around a 28-day schedule. So depending on your growing season, you can be looking at having a vastly different number of harvests. Somewhere in California, they can get 8 to 12 harvests a year because they've got that long growing season, and they're usually cutting it fairly frequently for that high quality. So it really does truly depend on, what your production scheme is, why you're harvesting it again, what the goals are. But typically that 3 to 5 cuts for the Midwest is pretty usual.
Okay, so when they're planting forages, when somebody's putting together a good mix, they're not just going to go out and cut the fescue and the clover and some orchard grass that's growing out wild in the pasture. When they're actually planting a forage pass, I mean, how often would a good mix that you would recommend for, let's say, a beef cattle operation, how long does that last once they plant it?
Great question. Again, it depends. I worked in extension, and that's our favorite answer is it depends. So if
well
it's
done.
well managed,
That's what I was going to answer my 5-year-old question with. I didn't think of it quick enough.
So it depends on how it's managed. If it's well managed, we're not beating it up a lot. You can get 4 or 5 years in certain parts of the U.S. Now, if we are harvesting that 8 to 10 to 12 times a year, a lot of times that's going to be more like a 2-year stand. In Montana, a lot of times what we would tell people is expect about 20 harvests out of your stand. So if you're harvesting 5 times a year, that could be 4 years. If you're harvesting 1 time a year, I don't recommend leaving it in for 20 years, although I have been in some 20-year-old alfalfa fields.
Really?
Wow.
Yes.
Yes.
I bet those are pretty sparse.
Some of them surprise you. Some of them I don't really think you can still call an alfalfa field. But yeah, out there when you're only getting, one cutting a year, it really doesn't have to work too hard.
When we're for our listeners, we're talking about harvesting. Generally speaking, we're baling. At least in our neck of the woods, we're baling all this into round bales or square bales at sometimes, or large square bales, and then storing them for feed over throughout the winter and on into the spring. So, is there anything in particular with the managing and the cutting of alfalfa that growers should be aware of? I think high quality alfalfa is different than just you know. We all see alfalfa fields. We go by it and it's like, boy, that's a beautiful stand. And then 2 years later, it's kind of thinning out. But it's a high management crop, isn't it, to get the most out of it?
Yes and no. So it's really funny. Growing up, in the East Coast or the Northeast, alfalfa was seen as you said, an intensive crop. Took a lot. You were harvesting multiple times. But out west, there's a lot of people who think it's an easy crop because they plant it and, they have a couple chances throughout the season. If a hailstorm or something like that happens, that they still can get a crop off of it yet that year. But in terms of managing and storing and things like that, again, I always go back to what is it that you're shooting for. We know that as plants mature, that the quality goes down. So the earlier you harvest, the better quality you're going to get. But your yield, you're going to lose a little bit of yield. You're sacrificing on that. And also you're asking a little bit more of the plant. And so you might stress that plant a little bit more than, say, if you let it go to a little later maturity, got higher yield, but then, had a little bit lower quality. That's why things like HarvXtra are really important in terms of optimizing quality as well as yield. And other things are weed control. When you see those declining alfalfa stands, a lot of times there's weed invasion that's coming in because those plants are stressed and the weeds have the opportunity to take over. So having, a good herbicide management plan really does help with that sort of issue.
So is there any, Dr. Meccage, is there any downside to having the HarvXtra trait? I mean, if you're planting alfalfa, you're planting for the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, so you got to get it right. And is there any downside to the HarvXtra trait? I mean, do you have to consider that if you're in like regular alfalfa? Okay, now I'm gonna make a change to a traded alfalfa. Is there any downside to the HarvXtra trait?
Sure. I did actually some research. I was very fortunate before I came to Forage Genetics to do some research with HarvXtra as well. So I can say I know now. I'm obviously a little bit biased, working for this company, but I don't work and promote things that I don't believe in. The downside to HarvXtra would be if you're an organic producer and it's obviously a GMO technology. You can't use that, right? So we'll get that out of the way. In terms of if you don't have any of those restrictions, HarvXtra truly can add a lot of value to almost any farm. Whether it be you've got a lot of acres that you're trying to cover and you don't want to lose quality, we tell people, harvest your other non-HarvXtra fields first and come to HarvXtra later. You're going to have similar quality to those other fields that you harvested before. So when it goes into the bunk, it'll be a little bit more consistent. If you harvested early, it can add quality to the overall, your overall feeding program, just again, because it's that higher quality product. There's a lot of different uses for it. It's stacked with the Roundup Ready trait, which makes weed control a lot easier. You don't have to worry about quality decline, because you have weeds in your product. There's truly a lot of benefits from feeding HarvXtra alfalfa.
Great.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say that, and the importance being, the quality being, is that if you have a high quality alfalfa, you don't have to add as many supplements, right? I mean, you get it tested. I mean, you know what the protein value is, and it's just a lot easier when you have a consistent high quality product. So it's better to invest on the front side, buy the better product, and it definitely pays off. What's the rule of thumb? You never get hurt buying quality, right? And so,
absolutely.
So this is a good example. Go ahead, Ryan.
So obviously this HarvXtra has been something that product and development has come up with. What else are you working on? What's in the pipeline? I mean, as we look at things like short corn and disease resistance and drought tolerance, and so and that's in our row crops and our grain crops. So what's new in the pipeline for forage?
Yeah, Dr. Message, because you're getting ready to go out in the plots, right? I mean, that's one of the things we set this up earlier in the morning because you're headed to the plots.
Yep.
So what are you doing out there?
It's 94 degrees out today, and we're going to be looking at some alfalfa and some other we call them diversified forage crops today. In our pipeline, you mentioned disease resistance. That's obviously really important, particularly if we want to prolong the lifespan of alfalfa, maximize yield. So we're actually looking at how we can use genetic screening to increase our speed that we can develop these disease-resistant plants. We just released a product a couple years ago that we were able to screen it for a resistance to a new race of anthracnose, and we were able to bring that to market pretty rapidly. We're looking at, how can we make more salt-tolerant alfalfa varieties? We've got some trials in our Idaho locations as well as our Garden City, Kansas locations, screening for improved salt tolerance. We're also looking at, pest resistance. Blue alfalfa aphids are really a problem in the West. And so how can we get varieties out there that are going to be more resistant and more tolerant to those sorts of pests? So really looking at how we can make an overall healthier plant that's going to help the growers in terms of, their return on investment and also their overall productivity.
And where are you at now? Dr. Message, where are you at now? Where are these plots at?
So I'm actually in Bismarck, North Dakota, and the plots are about 30 miles northwest of here.
Okay. And that seems like alfalfa would be with corn and soybeans, we see them in the greenhouses. Is most of this out in the field, or do you have greenhouse trials as well? How does that work?
Both.
Okay.
So we generally start our breeding program in the greenhouses. Then when we do our selections on our seedlings, we would then transplant those seedlings to the fields, the one that we want to select from that seem the most vigorous in the greenhouse. We run them through a couple years of testing in the field as well before we have any products that we would even take to what we would say our SIN 1 program, where we start collecting seed from that. And we still have selections there as well before we would ever commercialize any sort of product. So all of our products typically undergo, I would say, about 10 years of breeding and testing before it's actually released to the market.
So I feel like that we're probably frustrating you a little bit because we continue to go back to alfalfa. So give us a list of your forages. Tell us, because you keep saying all of our products, which is fine, but let's talk about those because I think we're showing our limited knowledge by continually revert back to the one we know.
To the 5-year-olds. How would you explain this to Ryan and Sal?
Right. So go back to explain to a 5-year-old to tell us what your product lineup actually looks like.
Well, so Forage Genetics only deals with alfalfa, but we have our sister brand, our Cropland brand, which they do things like wheat and millet and sorghum. They've got sunflowers and peas. They've got a lot of these more niche crops, if you will, that's also in their lineup. Now, they aren't doing the breeding for it. Again, Forage Genetics just does the breeding for alfalfa, but they do offer those for sale and sourcing.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that.
If someone is going to start a new alfalfa stand, and I think that you made a comment there, I don't know if our listeners caught it, but all through the growing season with corn and soybeans, which is what we are mostly here, we have some wheat, double crop soybean rotations, but I mean, it's that whole growing season. I mean, we do kind of hold our breath. We get thunderstorms through southern Indiana that come through, and we have hail, we have straight line winds, we have all these other events. And you made a comment there about kind of some risk reduction to growing an alfalfa crop. So kind of drill down into that just a little bit more. If somebody wants to get started into an alfalfa crop for a hay production, what's the best time of year and what's the best way to get started in an alfalfa production system?
Absolutely. And, I think I always talk about it's important to diversify your entire rotation, right? I mean, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And so having something like alfalfa mixed in with your corn and soybean rotation has a lot of benefits, not just financially, but soil benefits as well. One of my favorite things to talk about is, the sustainability aspects of alfalfa, but that's not the question here. So, in terms of getting an alfalfa stand started, there's typically 2 times of year that most people would look at, spring and fall. Probably no surprise there. We see a lot more switching to fall planting, just because, again, less pest pressure, less weed pressure, that sort of thing. And we seem to get a really good establishment there. Your seed bed prep is so critical, making sure you have a nice level seed bed. One of the biggest reasons I see stand failures is because the seed depth was, either too deep or too shallow. So we can see stand failure from that. The other reason I see a lot of stand failure is actually herbicide carryover. So particularly if, you had corn and soybeans in that field prior, always make sure that you're reading those labels and that you haven't applied any chemicals that are going to inhibit germination of the alfalfa at planting.
Yeah, it's not as simple as saying, okay, I just took off my corn or soybean crop. Oh, I'm going to plant some alfalfa. You better think about what you applied and when you applied it. So it's almost a 1.5 year type of plan to know I'm going to go into this field, get an alfalfa stand established. So I need to make sure I use the right herbicides that don't carry over into alfalfa.
Absolutely. And we see some of, the common chemistries that people are using. You mentioned 18 months. It can truly have an impact 18 months after application. So, being very intentional with your rotations and making sure that you're looking at all of those different aspects on top of everything else really can help make sure that you have success.
Okay.
So you may have touched on this. Production-wise, where are your production acres at for this seed stock?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by where?
Where do you get the seed? Where do you put your seed? Whenever you go to production to harvest the seed, where
is that? Where are you growing all of that?
Okay, so most of our seed acres are actually in the PNW. We've got some in California. That would be for like our non-dormant alfalfa varieties. And then we also have some Canadian production as well, on top of some Australian production too. We've got some contracts in Australia for some of our seed products as well.
Okay, thank you.
Does most of our alfalfa, just kind of curious here, I think alfalfa, I think milk production. Does most of our alfalfa go to dairy, or does it go just beef or horses, or how does that, as far as the consumption for feed, where does all that go?
The majority of it does go to dairy. That's a lot of our focus when we're talking about education and marketing efforts. But a lot does get used for beef cattle as well. Horses, I would say, is a smaller but still important market, particularly with those performance horses, race horses and things like that. But a lot of times, horses don't need that high quality forage. But for beef, we do see, again, some of the agronomic benefits translates into why it's fed a lot, is particularly on Western ranches, because it's easier to establish out there, high yielding, that sort of thing. But dairy is definitely the main focus for alfalfa use.
Okay, good. And another thing that you had said was the rotation. There's a lot of benefits of moving alfalfa into a corn soybean rotation. And tell us, as far as what those benefits are going into corn. And you did mention sustainability, but that is a big thing. That is a good thing with the root system. So what are some of the benefits of transitioning out of alfalfa into a row crop?
So the number one thing I always like to mention is the nitrogen credit. I think that's one of the biggest benefits from alfalfa. And that's just, the alfalfa being a legume, it has this nice symbiosis with rhizobia. It can take nitrogen from the air and is able to actually fix it and create a usable source of nitrogen for plants. And when alfalfa is terminated, if it's healthy at termination, it'll actually leave that nitrogen in the soil for the next crop to use. And there's been a ton of research done on this where it's finding that with a corn crop, say, after alfalfa, we don't really need to apply any nitrogen. We can meet all of its needs in that first year with the nitrogen that's left behind. And we may actually be able to reduce nitrogen needs the second year out of alfalfa by about 50% as well.
Wow.
So it's a significant source. Absolutely.
I didn't know that.
Huge benefit there. A lot of people don't, which is crazy to me because it's such a huge savings in terms of, the amount of money you're spending on fertilizer. Also, we see just a rotational benefit, a yield boost just from, that corn following alfalfa. Research from Wisconsin found about a 10% increase in yield that wasn't explained from that nitrogen benefit. So there's, two huge positives there. And then you mentioned the root system. Alfalfa roots can grow up to 5 feet per year. So you can imagine, how deep that can get if that plant's in there for 4 to 5 years. And that helps with, erosion and soil aggregate size, that sort of thing. So many different benefits that I could literally spend hours talking about.
So we can edit this out if it's down completely the wrong path, because I kind of forget from my days out in the field. But on your rotation, you don't want to plant alfalfa following alfalfa, though. Correct?
Good point.
Correct. Yes, that's a really good point. So alfalfa does have an autotoxic compound. It's only toxic to itself. That's why, with a thinning stand of alfalfa, we don't recommend to go back in and reseed it to try to thicken it up. It basically inhibits germination of new alfalfa seedlings. So waiting a year, maybe 2, if you have heavy soils in between your alfalfa stands, will make sure that we don't have any issues with that.
All right, we're leaving that in since I was right.
Yeah, he is pretty proud of himself across the table. Right. I'll tell you that. Right. Dr. Meccage, what else would you like to cover today? Is there anything else we've missed? I'm sure
you've hit my favorite topics. We got the sustainability in there, talking about rotational benefits. Anything else you guys can think of?
I can't. Well, I think you about hit the end of our knowledge.
Yeah. You've brought us to the end of it, but no, thank you so much. And I think it's important for us to talk about it because it does get overlooked. Forages get overlooked in our area. We've burned a lot of grassland down to plant corn and soybeans in, and like I say, we're cutting Johnson grass and fescue and mixes of things to feed with, and it is an important piece of feeding rotations or feeding rations for many of our customers. So I really wanted to do a forage discussion, and I would hope that we could have you back on again and talk about this further. Maybe there's different times of year where there's more important topics or different topics that are front of mind for you that. We have a lot of livestock producers in our area, and I think it's important that we continue to stay at the forefront of thinking of all of their needs.
I think one of the things Dr. Meccage told us is that it won't cost much to do it right. Between the nitrogen credit, between the quality with the traits, you mentioned Johnson grass. I mean, with Roundup Ready trait. I mean, there's an opportunity to clean the fields up too, not to lose ground to trumpet creeper or some of these other perennial type weeds that we have in constant no-till that we've managed to control. We're not going to lose a step on those, and it sounds like it'll be something people could look at to go into this crop because we have a lot of equipment, custom harvesting and things like that with neighbors that have balers, and so this would be a logical or definitely an alternative that they could go to.
Yep,
absolutely, and I'll just add with the weed pressure, once alfalfa is established, it's actually a pretty good competitor with weeds. And so, if you're able to get it in there and clean it up that first year, a lot of times we don't need to do a whole lot to it later on. So, obviously a multitude of benefits from that regard as well.
I remember one of the older guys in the industry told me that the best weed control in alfalfa was a good stand of alfalfa. And
absolutely.
So that holds true. Well, Dr. Meccage, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Meccage.
Appreciate
Thanks
you
so much for having me.
Holding up your day. Now you're heading out to the plots. Well, thank you for taking time with us on the High Ground. So, and Ryan, that wraps up another episode of the High Ground powered by Premier Companies. And if you enjoy it, like and subscribe. That's important to us. And again, we're not sure why, but if you like the information or want more, you can put in the comments if you have more questions, and we can get Dr. Meccage the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.